On a quiet November afternoon in Pennsylvania, traffic moved normally through a small suburban intersection. Cars stopped, lights changed, people waited to continue their day. But inside one silver sedan sat a woman who had no idea that within seconds, someone nearby was about to open fire. Multiple gunshots would suddenly rip through the calm streets. By the time the chaos ended, 30-year-old Ebony Pack, a nurse, a mother, and someone many people described as deeply kind, had been shot multiple times, and investigators would soon realize something terrifying. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this, and the reason why would lead detectives down a path involving jealousy, revenge, and a conspiracy that no one saw coming. But before we get into what happened that day, there's one question that still makes this case so unsettling. Who would want Ebony Pack dead? And more importantly, why? Before we dive deeper into this case, welcome to True Crime Journals. If you enjoy detailed true crime stories that uncover the truth behind real cases, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And as you listen to this story, I want you to keep one question in mind. Do you think this crime was purely revenge, or something much darker? Let me know what you think in the comments as the story unfolds. Now let's go back to the beginning. Ebony Pack was known by friends and family as someone who cared deeply about others. She worked as a licensed nurse, a job that often required long hours and emotional resilience. But despite the demands of her career, the people closest to Ebony said she always found time for the people she loved. She was also a mother, and those who knew her described her as fiercely protective of her child. To outsiders, Ebony's life looked stable. She had a career, a family, and a future she was still building. But like many true crime cases, the danger that would eventually take her life wasn't coming from a stranger hiding in the dark. It was connected to something far more complicated, a relationship. At some point before her death, Ebony began dating someone who had recently come out of another relationship. And at first, it didn't seem unusual. People move on all the time. But investigators later discovered that this previous relationship hadn't ended peacefully. There were arguments, resentment, and unresolved anger lingering beneath the surface. And in some cases, those emotions can escalate in ways no one expects. But at this stage, no one imagined that these tensions could lead to something as extreme as murder. Until the day everything changed. November 28th, 2020. It was the kind of afternoon that didn't stand out. Ebony was driving through Lansdale, Pennsylvania, like she probably had many times before. At one intersection, traffic forced her car to stop. For a moment, everything looked completely normal. Cars idled, drivers waited, people went about their day. But somewhere nearby, someone else was watching. And then suddenly, gunfire, multiple shots rang out, shattering the calm. Bullets tore through Ebony's car. Drivers nearby panicked. Some ducked, others sped away. But when the shooting stopped, Ebony had been hit multiple times. Emergency services rushed her to the hospital. But despite their efforts, Ebony Pack did not survive. At first, investigators had to consider every possibility. Was it a random shooting, road rage, a gang-related incident? But the evidence quickly pointed in another direction. The attack was too precise. The shooter seemed to know exactly where Ebony would be, which raised a disturbing possibility. What if someone had set this up? And if that was true, who? Think about this for a second. If someone was able to track Ebony's movements closely enough to attack her at the exact moment she stopped at that intersection, do you think the killer knew her personally? Or could someone have been hired to do the job? Pause for a moment and tell me what you think, because what investigators discovered next would make this case even more shocking. Detectives began reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses, and what they found changed everything. Not only did cameras capture suspicious vehicles in the area, but phone records and witness statements started to reveal something even more disturbing. There were signs that multiple people might have been involved, which meant Ebony's murder may not have been a spontaneous act of violence. It might have been something far worse, a planned attack. And once detectives started connecting the dots, the motive that emerged would lead them straight back to the one place investigators often look first: someone close to the victim. As detectives continued digging into Ebony Pack's life, one detail kept resurfacing: her relationship. Investigators learned that Ebony had begun dating someone who previously had a complicated breakup with another woman. At first, this seemed like ordinary relationship drama, but detectives quickly realized something wasn't adding up. Phone records showed suspicious communication between several individuals in the days leading up to the shooting, and surveillance cameras captured a vehicle that appeared to be following Ebony shortly before the attack. This wasn't random. Someone had been watching her, and soon investigators would uncover a possibility that made the case even darker. What if someone had hired a killer? Think about that for a moment. Imagine finding out that someone didn't just want revenge, but actually planned a murder and convinced other people to help carry it out. Do you think something like that could happen over jealousy? Or do you think there had to be something deeper going on? Let me know what you think, because the next discovery would confirm detectives' worst suspicions. As investigators tracked the suspect's communications, they began noticing something interesting. There were conversations about payments, not large bank transfers, but smaller transactions and arrangements that looked suspiciously like compensation. In other words, someone may have been paid to kill Ebony Pack. This turned the investigation from a tragic homicide into something much bigger, a murder-for-hire plot. Detectives began identifying the people who might have been involved, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Authorities eventually focused on several individuals believed to be connected to the shooting. Two of the key suspects were men who investigators believed had participated in planning or carrying out the attack. Evidence suggested that the men had coordinated their movements, communicated before and after the crime, and attempted to distance themselves once the shooting occurred. But digital evidence doesn't lie. Cell phone records, location tracking, surveillance footage, all of it pointed toward a coordinated effort. This wasn't one person acting alone. It was a conspiracy. Eventually, investigators had enough evidence to begin making arrests. One of the first suspects taken into custody was Ricky Vance, the man authorities believed had been driving the vehicle used in the ambush. Not long after, detectives identified another suspect, Terrence Markey, who prosecutors alleged was the gunman sitting in the passenger seat when the shots were fired. But investigators believed the plot went even deeper. As they continued examining phone records and connections between the suspects, another name emerged, Chongling Dan. Prosecutors would later argue that Dan was the person who orchestrated the entire murder-for-hire plot. As the case moved through the legal system, prosecutors began laying out what they believed had happened. According to their theory, someone had been so angry and resentful over a relationship conflict that they decided Ebony had to be eliminated. And instead of confronting the situation normally, they allegedly recruited others to carry out the killing. A cold, calculated plan that ended a young mother's life in broad daylight. When you hear cases like this, it raises a difficult question. How does a conflict between adults escalate to the point where someone decides murder is the solution? Was this purely jealousy, or was there something else driving the decision? True crime often forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, and this case was no exception. When the case finally reached court, prosecutors presented the evidence that had taken months to gather. Jurors heard about the surveillance footage, the communication records, and the connections between the suspects that investigators believed proved the conspiracy. Defense attorneys challenged the narrative, arguing that the evidence didn't fully prove the prosecution's theory. But in the end, the jury had to decide whether the evidence pointed clearly to guilt. And after reviewing everything presented in court, they reached a verdict. Two of the individuals charged in connection with Ebony Pack's murder were convicted. They received life sentences in prison for their roles in the killing. For Ebony's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but no court decision could undo what had happened. A young woman had lost her life, a child had lost their mother, and an entire community had been shaken by the realization that such a carefully planned crime could happen in their neighborhood. Cases like this remind us that the most dangerous threats don't always come from strangers. Sometimes they come from conflicts that spiral out of control, from emotions that turn into resentment, and from decisions made in moments of anger that cannot be taken back. Ebony Pack's story is one of tragedy, but it's also a reminder of the importance of accountability and justice. Because even when crimes are carefully planned, the truth often finds its way to the surface. If you found this case interesting and want to hear more real true crime stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Journals. We cover cases from around the world, some solved, some still mysterious, and some that will completely change how you see certain crimes. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think this crime would have happened if the conflict had been handled differently? Or do you think the outcome was inevitable once the conspiracy began? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most important part of these stories is the discussion they start. And I'll see you in the next case.